So now I have the honor and the privilege to introduce our today's presenter, Dr. Deepy Sur. For myself, as a racialized social worker in a leadership role, I've had the pleasure of having Deepy be a mentor for me and being able to feel really inspired having Deepy as a mentor, and also the greatness that comes from seeing a racialized leader occupying these spaces that hopefully will encourage more racialized social workers and social work students to occupy leadership opportunities within social work and beyond. So Deepy is our Chief Executive Officer here at the OASW and a visionary leader who brings a unique blend of innovative thinking with diverse social work expertise and management experience. She holds extensive clinical social work experience in mental health, especially working with children and adults, trauma-informed care, and sexual assault survivors. Deepy has held formal leadership roles in strategy management, medical education, and health system planning at Trillium Health Partners and the Toronto Central Local Health Integration Network. Since joining OASW in the summer of 2019, Deepy has been focused on the implementation of a new member engagement structure, aka the Local Engagement Network Program, increasing professional development opportunities, and deepening the association's commitment to equity integration. Without further ado, welcome Deepy, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for giving me space to bring you this important talk today. But before I begin, happy Social Work Week to all my colleagues across the province, near and far. Now more than ever, our work and joint leadership is incredibly important. I do want to thank our board of directors and the hardworking team at OASW who believe in the work to advance our profession, but I also acknowledge their tremendous support of my perspective, vision, and leadership. Today, I bring you a talk on South Asian perspectives on leadership, particularly through my eyes. Well, the last 2 years have exposed many inequalities. In fact, there have been stark differences between rich and poor countries. Let's face it, it's exacerbated with social inequities, especially given the pandemic, across the entire world. Previously in 2021, the World Bank had estimated that by the end of that year, 150 million people worldwide would be pushed to extreme poverty. More complex social tensions have been aggravated by COVID, and they've led to increased violence, increased discrimination, and on the grounds of gender, ethnicity, caste, religion, and race across the world. Further to this, lockdowns have meant the closure of schools, which in turn has further aggravated the unpaid work that women have had to shoulder, not to mention underscored by health sectors that have posed further challenges by being under-resourced. A little bit about India. Home to nearly 1.4 billion people with 22 recognized languages. It's ranked the second most populous country in the world. Estimated by the year 2050 that India will have surpassed China to become the most populous country in the world. Yet nearly a quarter of the population still lives below the poverty line. Here's India's Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, Minister of Finance, who recently delivered the 2022 budget, which in particular aims to harness the momentum that India has made as the fastest growing large economy, targeting new growth opportunities in the green economy and tech industries. The government, in fact, is pushing forward with its citizen agenda, particularly focused on empowerment, promising jobs, inclusive development, healthcare transformation, and female empowerment. South Asian women, in fact, have always played a significant role in politics, media, music, and the arts. More and more, the value of women as business leaders has become pronounced. Many women, brave and courageous, have helped their countries deal with the consequences of this devastating pandemic in particular. Many have led and will continue to lead. Here's a few of note. Anisa, a journalist, visited patients in hospitals in the height of the pandemic. Annie is the co-founder and ED of the Center for Social Equity and Inclusion, and she mobilized a number of community supports for at-risk families. Here's Fatima, head of CDC. She led a national COVID-19 response. Ruxana, president of the National Program for Health Employees Federation, led over 100,000 healthcare workers in a smart lockdown strategy. Here's Tanjeen, founder of TransEd. She created an organization to support the marginalized trans community. Tika is the chairperson of Nepal's Disabled Women's Association. She supported women and girls, specifically with disabilities, to advocate for the needs of them in the pandemic. Additional leaders like the CEOs of tech platforms, AI technology, promotion of menstrual equity, manufacturing, software, and championing social responsibility have demonstrated incredible skills that many leaders around the world could harness. So, what's happening more locally? Well, senior leadership positions at Canadian companies, they're on the rise, despite economic fallouts. Still, the number of racialized women remains incredibly small. The collection of diversity data, it's not widespread, and women still have hurdles to join positions at the top, and women of color in particular more so. So the understanding of intersectionality has never been more important in our work. Women in the Workplace is one of the largest studies on women in corporate America. In 2015, the study was launched to give companies insights and tools to advance gender diversity, particularly in their workplaces. Between 2015 and 2021, over 750 companies participated in the study, resulting in 250,000 people who were surveyed about their experiences of their workplaces. Here's what they found. Well, women of color account for only 4% of C-suite leaders. We're not surprised by this. This number has not moved significantly in the past 3 years. Moreover, women's representation has increased across the pipeline since 2016, but especially still small for women of color. We're underrepresented in a number of leadership categories. Here's a compelling quote from the same study for you to consider. Allyship from more privileged colleagues can make a big difference in a woman of color's experiences. When women of color feel like they have strong allies at work, they're happier in their jobs, less likely to be burnt out, and less likely to consider leaving their companies. But although more than 3/4 of white employees consider themselves allies to women of color, far fewer at work are consistently taking key allyship actions. This absolutely means that diversity and performance are related, and they lead to above average results. Diversity winning organizations are adopting systemic business-led approaches to inclusion and diversity. And in the COVID-19 crisis, inclusion and diversity matter more than ever, and so do disruption and innovation. Let's take a closer look. The Ontario Nonprofit Association released recent data on women in Ontario for nonprofits. Women make up 80% of the nonprofit workforce in Ontario, yet only about 50 to 55% of nonprofit leaders are women, and they're more likely to lead smaller organizations. Immigrant and racialized women are less likely to be in senior leadership positions at all. So not only are women underrepresented in leadership, but they also are more likely to lead organizations with smaller revenues. Women made up nearly 68% of all CEOs of nonprofits with operating budgets of less than 5 mil, but only 40-ish% of nonprofits with operating budgets of 20 mil or more. In a 2010 research study that was actually focused on the GTA that looked at factors that enabled South Asian and African descent women to succeed as leaders, particularly in the college system, women shared their motivations for pursuing leadership roles. 4 themes emerged: inherent drive and character, the need for change, relationships and support, and passion for education. Other words that arose were difficult life lessons, adversity, faith, trust, honesty, excellence, risk-taking, relationships, and motivating and inspiring others. In Qatar, a bank CEO that shaped the culture of the bank by incorporating cultural values and learned behaviors, he particularly looked at the incorporation of humility. Leadership humility, to remind you, consists of a few things: self-awareness and openness, thinking of others' needs above his own, and holding true to values and beliefs using actions to illustrate. This bank CEO in particular, well, he chose to employ and incorporate his own set of values and examples, those that were taught in his home, focusing specifically on integrity. We know that in the global workplace, cultural values and learned behaviors can in fact influence and impact leadership style and vision. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about how it's influenced my leadership style, in particular, thinking about the way in which I'll lead today and tomorrow. But before I can even get there, it would be amiss to not talk about the intersection of race and gender. I'm a Canadian-born person to parents from India who speak Punjabi and practice the Sikh faith. Well, we were always taught to give the absolute best. And when you felt like you were running out of steam, you could find inspiration from family and community to dig just a tiny bit deeper. It's not possible for me to talk about my experience as a woman of color, specifically a South Asian woman, without thinking about intersectional feminism, a term first coined by our American professor, Kimberly Crenshaw in '89. Far too often, I know that I didn't fit the archetype of senior leaders. When I arrived at a meeting or workplace with confidence and preparation as I had been taught, it wasn't always perceived as such in the Western world. In fact, South Asian women are marginalized in their access to education, healthcare, and in their access to personal and professional development by being undervalued, underemployed, and often underrewarded. Women of color face unique odds and seemingly insurmountable challenges. Yet there's no doubt, in spite of this, we continue to push forward and thrive. Okay, so I broke the glass ceiling, but my worst fear, of course, is teetering on the edge of that glass cliff. When underrepresented people like me take on senior roles, well, those businesses seem to end up in trouble. And it isn't always because we don't know what we're doing. It's because the beginning of the story is often left untold. Like what stopped leadership prior to us that were both white and or male from being successful in those roles prior to racialized leaders? Are the chances limited before they even begin? The expectation of women of color when they reach certain heights seems to be different, if they are even expected to get there in the first place. On top of this, their contributions are often overlooked. This is because of a system of whiteness and structures that were already in place, not meant for people like me. Organizations can absolutely be influenced to implement diversity policies and practices, which can include disrupting the normative process and making change from business as usual. Changes that can appear like failure in the eyes of some structures. Frankly, some eyes of whiteness don't appreciate systemic change. Even still, organizations can incorporate the complex intersectionality that's the reality of the dilemma and the challenges faced by South Asian women. This intersectional lens gives us a chance to challenge universal categories. Intersectionality gives me and all of us a framework which allows us to unearth very complex, varied, and often contradictory effects which ensue when multiple realms collide. Realms such as economic, political, cultural, subjective, and experiential. For me, the value of intersectionality does not only lie in locating the hierarchies of social characteristics, but also deeply examining the ways in which they've become a currency of power. As noted, intersectionality is a way to understand the diverse experiences in terms of identity, social location, structural barriers, based on multiple forms of oppression for women of color. For me, I've been caught between my identity as a Punjabi-speaking South Asian individual, and on the other hand, being a woman. I've asked myself, how do South Asian women construct their multiple and intersecting identities, particularly gender, race, and then ethnicity? The journey is indeed complicated. So let's take this in context. Let's talk about the importance of context. The context of my identity in particular has been incredibly important to my leadership. At times, I have felt the need to speak for all of India. It's difficult to explain, But it was questions like, are all names that long in India? Or generalizing statements about people in my neighborhood. I remember thinking, yes, I might know more than you about the people around me, but I can only speak for myself and don't want to feel compelled to answer for my whole kind. What I do know is that the experience of my overlapping identities and oppressions have led me to give distinct preference to my lived experience as part of my journey. I have unlearned and learned a plethora of things. Ethnic identity changes over time. As things have shifted for me, I have placed increased value on hearing stories previously unheard. In addition, like many, the degree to which identity I want to talk about changes in various contexts and places over time. There is agency in choosing this at my own discretion. I'll try to describe this here. Well, my mother and my aunts overwhelmingly have drawn on discourses of ethnicity to identify themselves. This included naming themselves as Indian or Punjabi speaking, talking about regions or language, and narratives that live in the family backgrounds. This also always included attributing ethnic identification with food, clothing, and festivals. As important markers, it was the doing of cultural practice as a central piece to understanding themselves. By some contrasts, my sisters and my cousins as well, have been more likely to use the language of South Asian or other race discourse, such as racialized or women of color. This has been an essential core to myself rather than the practice of doing the South Asianness. In addition, I also draw on a larger header of being a South Asian Canadian as a racialized self-concept and identity. So, does the transcendence of racial and gender stereotypes create an impetus for developing a leadership style that is inclusive? Well, one of the biggest obstacles women like me face is the movement into managerial positions. A reminder that for every 100 men promoted at this level, barely half of racialized women reach this level. Here's how the concept of leading is often looked at in the literature: the intersection of strategy, leadership, and culture. Strategy: the direction and scope of an organization over a longer term, particularly in a changing environment. It considers the use of resources and stakeholder expectations. And we know it also looks at the competencies within an organization, internal resources, and the external environment and operations to add value. Leadership then is the implementation of that strategy, the ability to anticipate, envision, be flexible, and create. Lastly, culture is our shared values, attitudes, a way of our place of work. It's unique to our business philosophy and principles, and manifests in values, practice, standards, and policies. So, if culture is the social glue and the boundary defining parameter, and conveys a sense of identity for the members of the organization, and guides and shapes attitudes and behaviors, what skills are transferable from my lived experience? The answer: all of them. South Asian women have led in many ways. The political leadership demonstrated by women while fighting COVID-19, well, it's different from more conventional styles of leadership. The alternative style has been shown to be collaborative, empathetic, and reliant on transparent communication. In addition, I would position that South Asian cultures encourage assertive communication that aids in the success of South Asian descent in their ability to succeed as leaders. At the onset of the pandemic, South Asian women led in a variety of settings: heads of villages, members of legislature, mayors, health ministers, etc. They consistently demonstrated collaborative and empathic leadership styles by utilizing transparent communication to update the public, mobilizing communities through collaborative efforts, and ensuring an equitable distribution of resources and aid. The Harvard Business Review did a study on nearly 100 India-based companies. Of note was the ways in which South Asian leaders invested in people, different than Western companies. They took a deep, internally focused, long view, a desire to create a sense of mission that was different. It was one that was served when the business success was met through aggressive investments in people and a high level of employee engagement. The leaders of the most successful companies in India do engage with their country, culture, and employees in a characteristic way. And this is an important factor in their performance. In the same study, the Leading the India Way survey revealed an important difference between leaders from India and Western companies, particularly in how they focus their energy. Leaders that were asked to prioritize their key responsibilities from India named top 4 as ranked in the following way: chief input for the business strategy in particular, keepers of organizational culture, guide, teaching, and role modeling for their employees, and being a representative and owner of investor interests. Further to this, the same study noted an important difference between how Western leaders prioritize their key responsibilities. South Asian leaders were likely to own the strategy function, including taking the agenda setting and being visible in the role. They tended to focus on incentives that were around organizational structures and a culture that allowed for improvising. They viewed strategy as a set of enduring general principles for competing, such as developing competencies, embracing social purpose, and taking the very long view, an approach to business that they personally encoded in the company's culture. It's particularly important for me to understand how South Asian leaders see their role in strategy development. In particular, for me, that focus has been on motivating employees. In the same study I just talked about, directors of those colleagues that were working in human resources, they were asked to rank their top South Asian leaders using the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, a widely spread tool in the United States. The executives from India no doubt scored high on transformational or charismatic leadership, things that were designed to encourage employees to care about the goals of the leader and the organization. When the data was compared to the MLQ scores for US CEOs, they reported using a transactional style, motivating employees to act in the interests of the business by incentives such as promotions, sales and targets. So for me, creating an adapted culture at OASW has been rewarding and interesting. If culture is the central space of the organization's strategy and implementation, then for me, it is where the inherent drive and motivation also live. Leadership runs like a thread to integrate the culture. The thread of the culture is repeatedly talked about as a core organizational need and function. Creating my leadership style needed to be grounded in my identity. Importantly, creating an inclusive culture requires being grounded in employee experience, cultural humility, and interpersonal stance that is other-oriented, which means there's no discrete endpoint, but a commitment to an active engagement in a lifelong process. Recall, earlier I talked about the concept of leading and how it's looked at in the literature, the intersection of strategy, leadership, and culture. Well, we know that change does indeed need to happen at the intersection of personal and organizational transformation, and that the unique balance of good interpersonal skills, humility, and steady leadership is what distinguishes many ethnic minority leaders from leaders in the dominant culture. Well, perhaps it's time to inject a measure of accountability into the diversity objective, and maybe make it part of annual reviews, part of our data collection, and remind ourselves that success inherently lives deeply rooted inside of our association within the people themselves. And so I would position adding critical empathy and accountability to the new dimension of leadership. So you've heard me nod to South Asian leaders of note, discuss how strategy is viewed in the Western world, and I have shared literature that demonstrates leadership attributes and characteristics of South Asian women. I've also positioned for you the notion that lived experience matters in very distinct ways. For me, let me illustrate this through my stories. Well, Daddy said, you must be grateful. View your parents' perspective. Walk their shoes. But don't stop there. Do it repeatedly over and over. Each time you will see something new. Nearly 100 when she passed, she talked about being grateful for the things you receive, but not only this, but the things you give as well. Being open is crucial. It's encouraged and it's rooted in the ethics of our culture. The translation to leadership practice for me, well, humble leadership aids in the health of an organization, which means that openness can be encouraged in a team, likely revisiting the employee experience over time in a way to build and reinforce learning will build inclusivity. Let's move on. Mom said the kitchen table is where the magic happens. This was about community organizing to contribute to a larger system or whole, the good of the whole family. This is where she laid eyes on us, 4 daughters and a husband, where she looked for validation that together we would talk, listen, and problem solve. Worldviews were discussed, but it was often the place I had to push through discomfort. The translation to leadership practice for me is that burdens experienced by individuals where they are not respected for talents and their abilities is an ethical issue. Making time and space for dialogue is crucial. In fact, diverse groups work harder together. Data collected by a leader then should include reported experiences and be treated as factual. My dad said, let me tell you a story. Storytelling is a useful channel for exploring our worldviews and giving agency. In fact, for centuries in India, we have embraced different forms of storytelling. There's a richness in their diversity of form. In my own homeland of Punjab, my father recollects summer nights of telling stories from his parents and grandparents. My father has told me a story about himself as a teenager. He told me how his older brother was a prominent figurehead in his home. And when his brother was away from the village, my father was often more relaxed, not being under his watchful eye. While his brother was away, one day my father found a stray baby goat, and he raised it fondly for weeks. And he kept it hidden. He worried his father would likely send him away to a farm or slaughterhouse. One day, his brother came home unexpectedly and found the goat. He decided it was taking up too much of my father's time, and indeed did send the goat away. I never understood why he told me this story, as it always ended at the same point, and he told me the story several times. My father told me this story the first time when we got our first dog many, many years ago, and he laughed at our obsession over this new little puppy. The second time was when that same puppy went into surgery for an unintentional intestinal obstruction. Both times I couldn't figure out what the moral of the story was until he told me the final time. He told me the same story after we lost that same dog 12 years later, and we were devastated. He wanted me to know he understood the power of the connection between human and animal, and he wanted to tell me he could empathize, and that every story revealed a connection. The real revealed connection for him was about the animal teaching you about caring and kindness. He wanted me to know he could relate. The translation to leadership practice for me, well, promoting empathy as a leadership skill and building the requirement of interaction for well-being is crucial. It is more than inspiring action and gaining a deeper understanding. It's about building critical empathy as a leadership value. Finally, South Asian lessons didn't just exist in my childhood, but in adulthood as well. My father-in-law, my Baba, would say, your success is not a surprise to me. He believed I could defy the odds that were bigger than me because I could define the best moments. Look around you, he'd say, you've created an amazing world. Of course you're a leader. You've been for a long time. One of the tenets of critical race theory is called counter-storytelling. It involves the process of re-examining the dominant culture narratives. And for me specifically, it's the filter through which the dominant culture saw me. Counter storytelling then created a space for me and marginalized voices alike to create the narrative that defines their own experiences, and for me to define the best moments of my life. The translation to leadership practice for me was that invisibility is absolutely dangerous. Finally, it would be amiss to not share the amazing South Asian women and leaders near me each and every day, the multiple roots of my history and future. And I will close with this. You will have heard me position that being brown is not a deficit, and that the underrepresentation of South Asian women in the talent pipeline and the positions of leadership is a loss to our system as a whole. We as South Asian women have strong trust circles that we lean into, that motivate us to be brimming with ideas, and not only have the potential to defy conventional wisdom, but also bring about a change in society because we break the rules, we go beyond existing paradigms, and we think anew. So I'll conclude with this. As we continue to shape our profession and bring diversification of voice, come and join me. Join me where I have a seat at the table, because I will always find you a chair. Thank you.